Welcome back. This video is about the history of schools, and at the end of this video I will say something about the final assignment you have to do, you are heading for, but also the assignment for next time. And in that assignment you will elaborate on all the material we have presented in the 3 videos of today. And I start with the part of history, and in this section we will speak about history of Christian education in general, and we will speak about history of Christian schools in particular. First, I will give a few examples, and then I will speak also about how you can find out the history of your school. Sometimes that's very difficult. But before I start, I will ask the question why history of an institution is important. And maybe you can first switch off the video and reflect for a moment about the question, why should we think about history of our schools? Why is that important? Thank you. You might have thought about your own situation, about your school. Maybe you are working at the moment at this school and you are connected to several people who have worked on that school or even have been founders of that school. That's very interesting. But why is it important to have information about the history of a school? The first thing is that a mission of an institution, I have been speaking about in the previous video, is always rooted in a certain tradition. And you have to know, in the face of exploring, how the mission of the institution is rooted in that tradition. The next thing is that history is a source of new inspiration. So if you want to refresh your work again, and if you try to, when you want to try to refresh the practices within the institution, you can go back to history and try to find inspiration in the tradition. And there is also a need for refreshing tradition, because people within an institution changes a lot. We have a huge turnover in education. It's all over the world, but in the Western world, it's at least 20% per year that there is a turnover. So many people working within schools leave school after some time, and if you have such a large turnover, you have to keep alive the history and the traditions of your own institution. And the next thing is that also the context changes. When you have a mission and a vision and values and so on, you have to relate to your context, and when the context changes, you have to adjust to that context anew. But then it is important that you keep in touch with your own history. And more precisely, history of your school can be a trigger for you if you would try to innovate in your own context. And if you have questions about that, please send me an email. I come back on that in the next video. Before I will explain a bit more about the history of Christian education, I will give a few distinctions, which is important also for the exploration stage you are getting in. The first distinction is about roles, and I make the distinction between founders, funders, and owners. The founders are those people who founded the school, of course. And in Christian education, many times that had been pastors or churches who initiated a school board, and then the school board took it over and then made it possible to have the school at work. It is important to know who the founders are, because the founders were those people who precisely knew what were the ideas about what the school should accomplish. That's about the founders. The founders are not the funders. Maybe even the founders are not the same people who are maintaining the school. For example, you might have a school based in 1850, for example, and the founders are gone, and now there is a new staff, and many staffs have passed, and now the founders are not in picture anymore, and those people who are maintaining the school do not have connections with the founders anymore. That can happen. But then about the funders, maybe the founders were not those people or not those institutions that also funded the schools. Maybe there has been, for example, in the Netherlands, you have schools that have been funded by the state, whereas they have been founded by religious people. So it's different. In different systems, you will have a different relationship between the founders and the funders. In African countries and also in Asian countries, sometimes funders are NGOs. And then you will have a quite different relationship between the founders and the funders. And then the owners are those people who at the moment maintain the school. And that's not always the same. Sometimes you can have a very simple structure in which you only have a principal who is maybe has to be responsible for all what happens in the school, and he is accountable, made accountable by a board of the school. You can have that. Sometimes you have a society who is maintaining the school. So the owners have their own position, and when you are exploring your own context, it's very important to have very clear how the different roles of everyone is in your context. Then the next thing is the question, who are involved in the institution? And then we can have the community as a whole, for example, maybe a village in which a school is settled. You have the parents, of course. Parents are always involved. You have the church. In many Christian schools, there is a church involved. Not always. Maybe imagine that a group of parents coming from different churches decide to found a school. Then they are independent of a church. But then at the background there will be the church present. But not always is the church present when it comes to ownership or fundership or foundership. And then the last are the leaders, and the leadership is really, really important in Christian education, because most of the time the leader has to be the person who has to bear the vision, mission and values in his mind, and also has to practice this in his daily leadership. So these distinctions before we go to history. And let's go to the next slide. I have two perspectives. The first perspective is of Professor Ter Horst, which is a Dutch educationalist, scientist, and he says you could notice in history 3 turning points that has influenced the history of education a lot. The first turning point, he says, is about literacy. When people started to write and to read, immediately is followed by the need for education. For people have to be educated to read and to write. That will not be learned automatically. The second turning point in history, he says, is the invention of press. And we all know that's at the end of the 15th century. It happened in Europe, and that led to a very intense program of schooling. And that went together with humanism and Reformation. I will come to that in a minute. But the importance of that turning point in history is very important. I don't think it will be traced back in the history of your school to that point, but the influence we can still notice, because we have a lot of books in school. Also, when we are living in the digital area, we still have books. And the third turning point in history, Ter Horst says, is the starting of the digital era. The digital communication techniques influences us a lot, and we are learning more and more how to communicate in another way as we did in just reading and writing. And these points are important because they also influence the practice of daily life in a school. And I will not go in detail about that, but you can imagine how that has taken place in history. The next perspective is that we can say we can distinguish between 4 stages in history. So that's not the perspective of turning points, but that's the perspective of 4 stages in history from a Christian perspective. And we can distinguish between the period of the Bible, the period of the ancient times, the period of modernity, and that of late modernity. And I will explain it shortly. Let's look at the first stage, schools in the Bible. There is no certainty whether there has been schools in the Bible. What we know is that there has been training for officers. For example, in the court of King David and King Solomon, there was a need for training officers, and this is reflected very much in the wisdom literature. We have, for example, in the Proverbs, that book that in the Bible, it is thought that this book was developed on the basis of the experiences in the court schools in the era of King David and King Solomon. What we also know is that there have been priest schools, and you can think about Obadiah, who owned a priest school in the times of the prophet Elijah. And what we also know is that in the exile period there became synagogue schools. And that was very important because in the exile period there were communities in exile, and the responsible people in the community felt an urgent need for schooling, because in the Torah it is said that we should educate the next generation out of the law of God, in order to get to what we read in Psalm 78, that they will put their hope on God. So that's what we know about schooling in the Bible. And knowing that, we can immediately notice that there is not a direct relationship between schooling in the Bible and education in the Bible to what we are doing now in Christian education, there are, of course, lines that we can trace back to the Bible, but there are in between other stages that are very important. And the next one is the function of the school in ancient times. And it's very important to know, because then we see what is the function of a school. In Greece, what we are speaking about when we are talking about ancient times, in Greece, the importance of education of the school was related to the preservation of city life. There had to be offices to preserve that everything could go on in the democracy of the city, and they needed schools. And in that times, in the beginning of that times, most of the time the schooling was a matter of the elite. And later on they came also schooling for the lower class people, but it started with the elite. And that often is happening in societies, that schooling is starting to build an elite. And it is important to notice that, because from a Christian perspective we have to notice that there is no difference between classes. We should not support differences between classes. Then I will say something about schools in modernity. And modernity, most of the time we call the time which starts about in the 16th century, when science is developing, knowledge is developing a lot, and also technology is developing. And you see then that in Western European countries there is an increasing need for schooling. And then you see in the most countries that many schools are coming. It's also the period in which, for the first time in history, students are put in classes. And that's something we see until now. In the Reformation and humanism, there was an important idea which influenced that period a lot, and that's the idea that schooling was not just for the elite, but had to be for everyone. So that was very important in that time, that people said to each other, yes, we have not to train just a few people for reading and writing, but we should educate everyone. And then the last stage is about late modernity. Let's say that's our times. Most of the time it is said it is the second half of the 20th century and the first half of the 21st century we are living in. And in this period, it is a characteristic that education is seen an instrument in the hands of governments. And not only in the hands of government, but in practice it is also in the hand of the market. So then you get an economic aspect in education which became very important. And I'm curious how that is in your situation. And we will speak in this course further on when you will come to Gouda for the on-campus seminar. We will see that there is a growing tension between two ideals. And the first ideal is about the ideal of instrumentalization. When we have a lot of techniques, let's say in our times a lot of digital means like smart boards and so on, it is possible to instrumentalize every detail of education. You can plan it and you can test it. So there is the risk that all education can be mastered from top to bottom. And the other development is that there is a large need for authenticity. Nowadays, parents many times are looking for getting their children trained as authentic as possible. They have to flourish in their own way, and you can notice that there is a tension between what is done or idealized from the top, that there is that education is an instrument for economy, let's say that, and on the other hand, there is the ideal of parents and most of the people in our Western countries to let the individual flourish. So let go them their own way without bothering about economics or without worrying about how the nation is going on. So far about general steps in education. I have said that Horst distinguished between 3 turning points in education, and then I have mentioned 4 stages in the history of education. And now we can ask, what is it for Christian education? And then it's important to see that the most earliest periods of Christianity, there were hardly specific schools for Christians. Schooling was there if it was in society, and Christians participated in it or they did not. A revival on that started in the bishopship of Augustine, Saint Augustine in northern Africa, and he developed the thoughts about education. There had been already other thinkers in early Christianity who were thinking about education, and they developed a kind of scholarship, but Augustine made a framework for education which is still influencing us now. Originally in Europe, Christian education was seen as religious education. So education was used in monasteries, for example, but also in schools in the city, to have the people educated in the doctrine of the church. So every child has to know the Lord's Prayer, the commandments, and also the confession of the church. That was, generally speaking, what was happening until, let's say, the 17th century. And then it went on to the 19th century, and then we get more and more the division between church and state. And then you get the idea that you could have Christian schools and non-Christian schools. So the product of let's say, Christian school is actually a product of the Enlightenment. For the Enlightenment started with very clear insights about the separation between science and religion, and also between state and the church, and that influenced our thinking about schooling, education. And then in the 19th century, specifically in the Netherlands, came the idea that we should develop Christian schools, specifically for Christian children raised in Christian families. So far, generally about Christian education and the history of that. And I would like to give you a few examples of what can happen in a history of a school. So I'm leaving now the stages of history. I'm now going to what can happen in our times to a school. And I give 3 examples, and I start with a very famous institution in the world. It's one of the most famous universities, Harvard University. And the interesting thing is that Harvard University was started as a seminar for preachers. So it started not as a university in which high standard research was done. No, it started as a religious institution. So you could say it was actually a Christian school, a Christian institution. It was founded in 1636, and it became its name by its founder, Harvard, Reverend John Harvard. So the interesting thing is that you could go back to the thinking of John Harvard to find out what were the initial thoughts of John Harvard about mission, vision and values. And there are many teacher training institutions in the world that are rooted in institutions like it was in Harvard University. We have many examples that a theological college started with just a seminar for training preachers, but then when schools came up, then there was also a need felt for training teachers, and that happened, for example, in Canterbury. Canterbury Christ Church University initiated in a theological seminar and then in a teacher training college. And we currently have that examples in Africa. And I know one example, for example, in Pretoria, that has Mukanyo College, that started as a theological seminar, and then when schools came up in the communities, then the need was felt for training teachers, and they felt an urgent need to create a teacher training college. That was the first example. The second example is from the Netherlands. It's about a little school, a small school called Het Mosterdzaadje, which is translated in English, the mustard seed. And you see on this slide a picture taken during the celebration of the 125th anniversary. And it's very nice, they have dressed themselves in clothing of that time. And I came across that example, and I thought it's nice to mention in this lecture because it's exemplary for how a school history can go. It started in 1889, and it was started by a group of people in a small community who were thinking about the liberal preaching in their churches. You know, in the 19th century, in many Western countries, theology suffered from the influence of Enlightenment, and there were also people who were defending the Orthodox faith, and in that community there was a liberal group and a more Orthodox group, and the Orthodox group decided to start a new chapel. And you see it on the slide, the image of the chapel. But they immediately decided not to have just a church, but they said, no, when there is a need to preserve the gospel, we need a school in which we can tell our children about Jesus. And they built a school which was open for everyone, so they didn't like to be just for a separate group, but they were open for all the children of the community. And they had children, but at the end of the 20th century, the amount of pupils diminished, and then they were about to be closed. And the interesting thing is that the team of the school, which were just a few teachers, of course, they started to pray every day for getting more pupils. And the Lord blessed it, And nowadays they have about 80 children, and they told me that they are expecting more than 100 pupils in next year. So that's how a history of a school can go. It is an illustration of how a school can start, but also an illustration of how a school develops within the context of culture, the surrounding culture, in this case in its own little community, but you could also say in the culture of the Netherlands of the 19th century, which is also developing, and in confrontation with the developing country, the school have to adjust. So let's leave it for now with that example. I have a third example, which I came across in Africa. It was a school that started under a tree. It's in Sierra Leone. I was there in 2008, and we had the assignment of the developmental organization Woord en Daad, which is based in the Netherlands, to give training to teachers in a refugee camp called Grafton. And then I came across a principal of one of that schools, and he told me the story how that school started. And he told me, when I saw all the children in the refugee camp, there was just one thing in my mind: how will these children grow up? And the next thing is, will they also know the Lord Jesus? And then in a day he called all the children he met in the refugee camp under a tree, and he said, I will start a school today, and I will give you lessons. And this impressed me a lot, because he continued to do that under the tree, to give lessons, and then it was blessed, and children became to be more happy, and it influenced also the parents in the community. And then they started a building to build a school, and it developed more and more and more. And it also influenced the development of people in the refugee camp who could get work. So this is quite another example in another context, but you can see here that that person, Pastor Dijk, felt an urgent need to build a school in his context. And he was very creative in using just simple means. For if you just have a place under a tree to educate, you have no books, what should you do? You can at least tell stories. You can perhaps also, by means of writing in the ground, let them write, for just to mention a few examples. He was very creative in that. So context and the history of schools is very important, and I invite you to think about the history of your own institution and how in the context of that institution the calling is felt by the founders to found a school. And I will speak about, and then I come to a kind of a conclusion in this video. I will speak about the motives of founders, and I have to distinguish between three concepts, and you see this on this slide. I distinguish between motives, aims, and ideals, and try to keep this in mind because you can use it when you are exploring your own context. Motives are, generally speaking, the reasons why you do something. Aims, you could say, are a precision of the vision. As I have explained in the previous video, vision is about the future. So you are aiming for some goals in the future, and aims are means to make that practical, to make that precise, to make it workable in your school. Ideals are about dreams, are about how you could reach that goals in an excellent way. And these three concepts, motives, aims, and ideals, are important because they will direct how you continue to go on with your school. And consequently also direct the innovation you are heading for. So if you are planning an innovation in this semester, try to go back to the motives of your school about education, the aims of your school, the ideas of your school, but not only of your school, but also your own motives, ideals, and aims. And next time I will give you 6 indicators to help you to find out what precisely are the motives, aims, and ideals of stakeholders in your own context. But I will conclude this lesson with something to say about motives. For it is important to know that there are different kind of motives to start a school. What we see in developing countries is that many times Christian community decides to found a school not just for religious reasons, but just to fight poverty, because they know when we would like to survive, we need schooling, we need education, we need to fight poverty, but we need education. So the Christian community starts a school you could say for economic reasons, but I would not say economic reasons, but you could better say they would serve the community and the country. So it's for letting the nation flourish. And that's one type of motive you can have. And the other motive is much more in the religious atmosphere. That motive is about how we can preserve the gospel in the next generation. So it's about the first aim in a Christian school to have the Christian doctrine taught, and that's quite another quite another motive you can find in the environment you live in. And I invite you to read the article. It is in the online system. It's in the assignment for next time. And then reflect on the question, what were the motives? What kind of motives did the founders of my school, of my institution had when they started the school? I am now coming to the final slide of this video presentation, and it's about the assignment. Let's look at the assignment. The assignment is as follows: study the history of your school or your organization and find out which documents there are about the origin of the school and what were the motives of the founders. And also try to interview people who can tell about the founders. Maybe the founders are passed away long ago, but maybe there are still stories within the community you live in or within the institution you are working in, and people can tell about how the school or how the institution developed over time. The second is read the article, which is about a model I'm going to tell about more in detail the next time. And it is called the Christian Education Worldwide module. And you can find it in the system. And in the assignment, I also have written the following sentence. Check whether you can understand the model by explaining the model to someone who has not studied the model. So instead of giving you a test, try to test yourself by just taking the picture in the article and then present it to someone who doesn't know about Christian education at all, perhaps, and then try to explain what is the model about and what are all the details in the model about. When you will be able to explain it to another one, you have understood it. Let me give you a suggestion for the first part of the assignment. When you try to find out the history of the school, try to interview different people. I suggested already to interview people from your own institution. Maybe they have stories about the history of the institution, but maybe there are also people in the surrounding context who are not involved in the school anymore, but maybe they know from other sources how the school developed. For example, a journalist of the Journal of the City. So think also about interviewing other people. And not to forget also the documents about the stories of the school. And maybe there is not only a history book about the school, but there are letters or there are articles in newspapers on celebrations that has taken place in the history of the schools. And then to conclude, try to ask in the interviews about motives, aims, ideals, vision, mission, values, like we have discussed in this lesson. And I invite you to make notes as much as possible, because you have to use it at the end for the final report of the exploration stage. Thank you for listening so far to this video about the history of Christian education in general and about how to find out the history of your own institution placed in its own context. And I'm hoping it will help you to find out your own calling for how to innovate in your own school or institution. If you might have questions, please send me an email.